The state of the world in 1407 was an odd one. Indeed, there were certain vectors towards which worldly power flowed, but when one saw the map simply as it was, Europe appeared fractured, hopelessly divided, a kaleidoscope of conflict and disunity that had only just begun on the road to broad political alignment. Indeed, Europe was still, after all this time, in chaos. The spiritual world, meanwhile, was much less ambiguous. The Catholic world lorded firmly over the West, and had handled almost all of its heretics, while the Orthodox East was closing in on its Catholic exclaves, stretching from southern France and Italy to the frigid Baltic Sea. Relations between the two spiritual realms were icy to say the least, but this totalizing division meant little to those outside of the Christian world, as to them they saw a sprawling Christendom dominating 3 continents and continuing to grow by constant proselytism and provocation. Islam continued to be on the absolute brink, Hassan and Al-Maizar the last 2 Muslim realms in the known world, Kor and the Perizzids converting away to Orthodoxy, while the Faroukzads, one of the best hopes for the Muslim world, converted to Orthodoxy, though their Sultan had recently converted to Buddhism. Speaking of which, Buddhism continued to be on the rise, by and large of the Theravada sect, though Mahayana Buddhism began to trickle in from the east around that time as well. Returning to a recounting of the temporal powers, one begins with the empire that houses the chronicle, the Empire of Vannonia itself. Vannonia had, in the last century, expanded its domain to include more of the lowlands and more of France, growing its impenetrable buffer to the sea. Besides that, however, Vannonia was mostly involved in keeping the peace and maintaining the sheer mass of internal problems that an empire of that size involved, namely the constant Sixer revolts and abnormal monarchs. Iberia was a roiling cauldron of petty kingdoms and political intrigue, though the main flavor in the pot was the Burgos Federation, which had managed to, by and large, fight off local challengers while adding Dalmatia, as well as several minor German principalities, to its domain. Such challengers included Occitania, Asturias, and most notably the Empire of Isbilia, a recent breakaway from the Burgos Federation. The Gallic region had not changed much, save for the mild expansion of Vannonian power there. France and Occitania had taken some time off from their centuries-long rivalry in order to do some meddling abroad and shore up their own positions in the event of significant conflict. For example, France had set its sights north and east, claiming land along the North and Baltic Seas, as well as in the Germanic heartland, even managing to lose a region just north of the Alps, the local French settlers breaking away and calling themselves Alençon. While the French went east and north, the Occitanians went south, taking land in Sardinia, Iberia, Italy, and especially Africa, where it was rumored they shared a border with Mali. The Italian region had made no progress towards unity in the past century, in fact becoming more divided. A century ago, Italy was mostly Catholic and Lombardia was primed to drive its way south, funding its many conquests via a trade partnership with Venetia. However, not only did that trade relationship break down, meaning Lombardia was unable to continue its conquests, but the southern kingdoms and principalities did business with the Orthodox Trade Republic of Venetia instead, and through this contact with them became Orthodox converts themselves, allying with the Trade Republic and with each other. Italy was now hopelessly divided between the Catholic North and Orthodox South, with the Italian Catholics in North Africa falling to heresy by the thousands, unable and unwilling to aid their brothers across the Mediterranean. Lombardia had since suffered constant revolts and was forced to ally with the Pope, who they had once hoped to conquer long ago. The Germanic region during this time was further colonized and sat right in the middle of the Catholic Orthodox schism. The 2 major independent Germanic realms were Mainz and Köln, neither of which had expanded or become any stronger in over a century. Though there was a sliver of hope in the Principality of Cornton. Former subjects of Lombardia, they converted to Orthodoxy and allied with Venetia, even gaining access to the Adriatic Sea. They may have been odd saviors, being Italian-speaking Orthodox Christians, but their culture was decidedly South German. Only time would tell if such a seed had found fertile soil for itself. The northern region was fairly static and dominated by a declining Denmark. One major development had occurred as of 1406, and that was the collapse of the Lietuva Federation, which had once united a fair portion of Finland and the Baltic. In its wake, the Mongol remnant had found purchase, conquering the petty realms that had been unceremoniously ejected from it after the fall of their protective league, returning the Mongols to a place of dominance in the north. Eastern Europe was also the domain of a resurgent Mongol horde, which now worked tirelessly to weed out the Catholics that had found purchase in the east. The Balkans were somewhat more scattered than they were a century earlier, with the Magyars losing control of the Krakow Federation to their north and being challenged by the ascendant Philippopolis Federation to the south, with Visegrad and the Mongols hemming them in to the east. The only good news for them was the progress they had made further south in the Hellenic lands, though it was this progress that provoked the ire of Philippopolis, which drew upon resources from as far afield as Italy and Anatolia to challenge them in the Balkans. The eastern Mediterranean was dominated by the aforementioned Philippopolis Federation, who, through their alliance with the Empire of Lakandu, Orthodox lords of the Holy Land, brought peace to the region, and were slowly transforming it into a prosperous zone of commerce, challenging Venetia, even if it wasn't their intention to. This spurred Venetia to begin making distinctions between Eastern Orthodox and Western Orthodox Christianity, though, at least at first, this was an impossible task so long as the Catholics remained so dominant right on their doorstep. North Africa was still almost entirely dominated by European powers, though they had themselves consolidated, the major powers in the region being Occitania, Isbilia, the Burgos Federation, and Lakandu. This region was also rather prosperous, though this prosperity was immediately threatened by the violent posturing and increasing frequency of attempted raids by Mali to the south, which had fashioned itself into a continental nexus of hatred towards their neighbors to the north. Finally, the Middle East was consolidating into regional blocks of power, though the Muslims who were once so prevalent in the region were now backed into a corner. Christian Lakandu was bearing down on the Muslim alliance from the north, while the Buddhist Maturids and Farrukhzadids continued to flourish, crushing in on the insular states of Hassan and Ale-Mazar. It was uncertain if their meager alliance could survive such an onslaught. Indeed, if the Orthodox Mongols made it past the Caucasus, that could be the end for the House of Islam. Speaking of which, in 1409, Pope Gelasius III declared the 12th Crusade upon the Muslim alliance hugging the Persian Gulf, the exhausted states of Hassan and Ale-Mazar, which recently managed to conquer a pocket of Catholics who lived there. In 1414, Emperor Alexander IX gave himself the title of the Great in an attempt to make himself notable. His rule was an odd one, dominated and haunted by the complicated relationship he had with his father. For example, instead of entombing him in the royal Chashtal catacombs on the Isle of Man, he had him interred on the Isle of Orkney far to the north, in a church called the Chapel of St. Catherine. He despised the weakness of his father, but also the power he held over him as the reigning monarch. It is said he mourned his first wife, but also cheated on Martina again and again, as she represented his pitiable father's power over him. As such, he was a cold emperor, centralizing power, writing tracts defending the absolute nature of the imperial throne, and denouncing the High Lords of Vannin for their persistent lack of loyalty to the emperor, chastising them so much that the position itself became a kind of white elephant. Of course, one could become king of England, Alba, Nairn, or Normandy, but as lord over those kingdoms, the monarch was newly unable to divert taxes to himself, appoint bishops, build siege equipment, or even disagree with the writ of the emperor. As a result, Alexander IX was very skilled at keeping his vassals in check and successfully kept a good deal of them from joining conspiratorial factions. However, on the 16th of August 1425, Emperor Alexander IX Monad passed away at the age of 60, bedridden, infirm, and just like his father. His son, Emperor Alexander X Monad, ascended to the throne at the age of 33. He was an imposing man, tall with a huge beard and a genius mind who would have made his ancestors proud. Notably, he was the only legitimate child of Alistair IX, though he was neglected by his father for that fact. Alistair X sought to thank his mother Martina for her dedication as his mother, and involved her in his rule as his closest advisor, despite her general lack of skill in governance. His first act as emperor was to declare war upon Occitania to press his claim on the sizable northern province of Tours, from which certain Occitan lords had been raiding. Emperor Jean Monad, at this point a distant cousin of Alistair X, was totally unprepared for a war of such magnitude, as he had sent the Imperial Army south to make a major move against the Burgos Federation, hoping to break their line of defense at the Pyrenees. As such, Emperor Jean was forced to forfeit the province in 1428, though also sent an anonymous letter to Emperor Charles Alary, reminding him that he too had a claim on Tours. However, before Charles could act on that letter, Vannonia declared war for the tiny French province of Saint Pol in 1433. Because the weakened French were fighting both the Magyarország and the Krakow Federation, the war was won almost immediately. Such victories made Alistair X a wildly popular monarch with the masses. In 1436, Emperor Alistair X, leveraging his popularity and stepping on the recently neutered High Lords of Vannin, changed the succession laws so that women could inherit if there be no sons. The death of his sickly infant boy a few years prior likely influenced this decision. In 1437, Alistair X, with no checks to his power, increased the crown authority, believing that the crown held a holy right to rule without the intervention of its vassals, the one lesson that his father managed to impart to his boy. In 1439, he earned the moniker of the Bear, for how he mauled his enemies but loved his friends. In 1440, Pope Urbanus IV declared the 13th Crusade upon certain Muslim territories south of Abyssinia, due largely to the fact that the 12th Crusade was never fully committed to, and some major figures managed to flee the Middle East to there. Emperor Alistair the Bear jumped at the chance to go, and made the long journey south, taking 15 ships and 20,000 men with him. While he was making camp in the sweltering African Rift Valley, he caught malaria, and soon enough fever dreams came to Emperor Alistair X, known as the Bear, and they depicted an incomprehensible future. Lands beyond the sea and beyond imagination, weapons which rang out like thunder, and peoples the world over who fought wars the likes of which had not been seen since the fall of the devil from heaven. He saw nations upon the earth like stars in the sky, and he saw things both great and terrible which he would not live to see. He saw a new world stretch out before him, and he felt as though his empire would be a part of it. He would never know just how right he was.